let's just jump right in here. Sheldan, first of all, welcome back to Talk for Food. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Adam, for having me back.
You are, in fact, I did not even acknowledge it the first time. You are author of a book called You Are Becoming a Galactic Human. It talked about changes that are coming about, that are happening within us, and it talked about a reality that is really laid out for all of us as human beings, that is as part of being part of a larger community that's beyond planet Earth. And I didn't even realize it at the time. So your first contact is just going beyond that. Tell us a little bit about Your First Contact.
Your First Contact is a book that takes Galactic Human, the first book, it updates it and it expands it. So what I did with the updating it was I took the front end of the book, which talks about who I am, and wrote more about it, because when I originally did it, I was still learning to talk about myself. I still had this feeling of, does anybody really want to know who I am?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, who's interested in this?
Then when I did was I took the rest of the book and I looked at it and I based it upon the fact that I was now free to write the book the way I wanted to. So what I did was I expanded on everything and I updated it. Like in history, I started to talk more about modern history, which I didn't do in the original one. I just talked about history from basically the beginnings of humanity on planet Earth to the end, or the so-called fall of Atlantis. And then I didn't go too much beyond that. And what I did in Your First Contact was take that anchor point. I re-described the stuff that I did in the original book, Galactic Human, and then went beyond that.
Okay.
And in doing the original and doing the histories, I expanded all the histories so they got more detail in them.
Well, let's, without going into in totality of the history, let's talk a bit about it for our audience, because, the general rule of thumb is if we go through school, as far as we can tell, human history is only... we go back to the Sumerians or something like that, maybe like 4,000 or 5,000 years back in terms of civilizations and stuff, maybe a little bit with the Egyptians. And then the concepts of Atlantis and Lemuria are considered almost mythical or quasi-realistic, but there are more question marks in terms of general thought. But human history goes back way beyond that too, if I understand.
Right. Actually, our origins are extraterrestrial. Mm-hmm. And so our history goes back about 6 to 8 million years.
All right. Now, there we go. This is what I want. Now we're getting into it. Okay.
So what we have is a compendium of history that's mostly off-planet, because we don't really have a history that would really be of any consequence until we get to Lemuria, which is roughly about 900,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. So even if you look at that 900,000 years ago to present, history, according to quote-unquote recorded history, goes back about 6,800 BC.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Roughly the period just after the Ice Ages.
All right. Okay.
Because the Great Flood has roughly been dated around about 7 to 8,000 BC. And the flood basically marks the tail end of the influence of the Ice Age on humanity, because that's when we start having the really major heating up of the planet, and climatology starts talking about a more acceptable, more tropical type of world to grow civilization in. So it's a lot different. But if you look back at the histories of the people who wrote the histories at that time, you might say the historical history books are different. The Egyptians have a king list that goes back to roughly 50,000 BC.
Okay.
And they talk about a pre-civilization. And if you go to museums that have replicas or actual artifacts mm-hmm. from Egypt, the Egyptians were talking about the early remnants of these civilizations. And they have things like porphyry, bowls made out of porphyry. Porphyry is a very, very tough rock.
Okay, all right.
It's virtually impossible to cut with. Even today, it would take modern tools, and it would take a long time for any modern artist to do anything with it if he was so inclined or she was so inclined. And yet you have these beautiful bowls and artwork, and they call this the works of their ancestors. And they would give it to each other as special gifts of somebody of honor.
And they're made out of a material that would be difficult for us with our technology today to cut and to form, is what you're saying.
Right. Even with modern diamond drills and all the really incredible super sharp metals that we have today, it would be almost impossible to work it. Artists today, if you told them make a beautiful bowl that looks like a clay pot out of periphery, they would look at you and say, "Are you crazy? It'll take me years."
So was this periphery basically a molten, or was it
It was a metamorphic rock. It came from volcanic activity, and then it cooled and hardened into this very hard material, these rocks. And so it's all over in Egypt. And in fact, in Egypt, if you look at Egypt, you go from the artwork is far superior in the early ages because they're replicating the stuff from the former civilization that was the real civilization. And what a lot of archaeologists have admitted to is they call it Civilization 0 or Dynasty 1 or Dynasty 0 or Dynasty 01. That's about it. They don't really want to talk about it. And the concept of some advanced civilization existing before the early parts of Egyptian civilization, they don't want to talk about. And of course, you have these amazing technologies that are also talked about in, say, India, the Indus River civilizations, which point toward an earlier civilization beyond the 6,000 to 7,000 BC era, when they think that all these, what they call the early civilizations, the Mohenjo-Daro civilization, existed in. So you have this thing sitting there with a giant question mark.
Right.
What came before? Because there has to be something. Because they would not all be talking about in India, in Egypt, in Sumeria, in China, and even in the Americas. Sure. About this previous civilization, this super civilization that could do all these incredible things. And even in their ancient histories, the Indians talk about flying vehicles.
Well, sure. There are even references in the Bible and many other areas in sense of even the hieroglyphs that would have images that they look like spaceships,
right?
But also even space suits and stuff.
Right.
You're listening to Talk for Food on webtalkradio.net with Adam Abraham and my guest, Sheldan Nidle of the Planetary Activation Organization, and we are discussing First Contact. First Contact Extraterrestrial, contact with kindred, not with aliens, but kindred, ones who are like us and who are of us, so to speak. Certainly, there are indications that something that what would be advanced to us was happening way back in the past in this particular case.
And you even have in so-called caveman drawings, you have things that look like and appear to be beings from outer space in their ships. And they're saying, why would hunters who normally talk about things like bison, etc., suddenly have all this stuff in there? Mm-hmm. And there's all kinds of things. And when I was talking to people who were with the Aborigines, even an Aborigine shaman, he was talking about lamenting the fact that a lot of what the Australian government is doing is destroying these caves which have all these stuff in them, which shows how the Pleiadians and other people from the Galactic Federation came and were interacting with their grand Aborigine ancestors. Mm-hmm. So what you have here is the proof what we're talking about. It's all over, and they're trying, of course, to hide it.
I'm curious as to why the continued efforts to deny or not to even acknowledge the possibility, not to even allow the conversation to occur with a degree of respect of its possibility. There seems to be, from governments, from whether it's governments, military, it's all seems to be about suppression or just simple non-acknowledgement.
Well, if you acknowledge the fact that we are not earth-born, earth-based, and that our civilization was suddenly came out of nowhere because of human intuition, if you cannot acknowledge that and say that there's an alternative, then all the philosophies, the religions, etc., that are the basis of who and what we are,
become a house of cards, and they start to fall.
Exactly, and that's what they're afraid of.
That includes government too.
That includes everything.
Yeah,
includes everything.
It also, I guess, it would include the other part of this is that without a steep enough level of knowledge of who we are, there's certainly the possibility that we may think of that civilization as being superior to us as well. and alien to us.
Right.
I mean, all of our science fiction stories and films are all about these alien invasions that are going to come in.